Today, I am going to be speaking about how to surf the pipelines, cowabunga, right? So before we get started and dive into today's topic, Rick Duggan's going to give a quick announcement about a hackathon that's going to be coming up here. So, yes. Rick is awesome. Rick has helped co-found, or he's done everything, you name it. But he's helped co-organize the group, and I really appreciate your help with covering me when I can't be here. So thank you.
Yeah, happy to do it, Josh. So just wanted to announce we are in the early stages of planning a hackathon. So we're really trying to do something that's from the community. And so what we're working on is a fintech hackathon that is going to use AI to help people fundraise. So put all those pieces together. This is actually something that I'm working on with Kurt Walker, the Who's Got My Money pitch fundraising session that was from 11. And so what we're going to do is, it looks like it's going to be in late February. So if you are interested, I'll be here throughout the session, and just come see me at the very, very end of the session. We don't have a bunch of formalities for it yet. We're trying to generate the interest and find out if there is interest before going through the whole planning process. But feel free to grab me at the end and let me know if you're interested. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it.
So, quick question. So,
yes.
What is the hackathon kind of? Is there like a topic?
The theme is helping people improve their pitch decks.
Helping people improve their pitch decks. Okay.
So there's tons of information on pitch decks. There's tons of examples out there. Everyone tries to model after like Y Combinator or 500 Startups, or they get the Airbnb deck and they think they're golden. And most decks still end up being terrible even after all of that. So we think we have a solution for that, but we need help.
Awesome.
Okay.
Sweet.
Cool.
Thanks, Rick. Well, speaking of presentations that need help, I'll be diving into something I put together. I didn't have a ton of time to polish it up, so I apologize if there's some rough edges around here. But I'd love to make this a interactive, as with all my talks. If there's something that kind of intrigues you, you want to dive down the rabbit hole about something in particular, just feel free to interrupt me during the session, either by raising your hand or throwing a crumpled up piece of paper my way. So today we're going to be talking about deploying with pipelines. So first, I guess, let me just get a gauge. Who here has you actually built a CI/CD pipeline? Okay, so a good percentage. Who here hasn't built one, but in their development cycle, somebody else has kind of handled that, and it's a part of merge requests or something like that? Okay, so we got one, a couple. Okay, cool. Well, so I think a lot of the people here who have built pipelines, a lot of this stuff will look pretty vanilla. So at the end, maybe we can get into some more advanced parts of pipelines and things like that. But for now, for the folks here that haven't done any pipeline development or have no idea what I'm talking about, we'll get into that right now. So who am I? I am Joshua Copeland. I've been programming since 2006. I'm the CTO of Remote Dev Force, and I've been running this user group here since 2012. Why do I run the user group? Because I love giving out free knowledge and I love networking. As with my company that does software development, I love meeting developers and I love meeting clients that need developers. So always love talking to people. This is a picture of me grabbing a new pair of shoes here at a vintage store, literally walking distance from here, called Waves. Surf the pipeline, Waves. I figured it was appropriate. So anyway, if you do like vintage clothes, go check them out. They're pretty cool people. A little bit about my company. We've got over a dozen developers, all contractors here in the US. We specialize in US development. We have completed hundreds of projects, everything from your rinky-dink WordPress website all the way to full-fledged helping build startups like Wag Walking and other companies that have gone to be huge companies. You can hire just one dev or an entire team, and we have a bunch of different specialties. So if you do want to reach out, just feel free to email me. I have some of my cards here at the front as well. So in this talk, we're going to talk about why use pipelines. We're going to talk about how to set one up, both in GitLab and in GitHub, And then maybe if we have time, I'll give you a sneak peek into Azure DevOps, which I've recently had to do. And then we'll talk about the deployment side of things. Forgive me, there's going to be a lot of screenshots and stuff like that in here, but it is what it is. For your whopping $0 you paid, this is what you get. So why pipelines? Is it for the thrill, or is it because we want to automate our software development lifecycle? Well, it's probably the latter, right? If you're just coding something by yourself, let's say you have a little website that you built yourself, do you need to go and build a pipeline and all this stuff to automate the deployment and the testing and all that? No. You're completely fine SSHing right to the server and pulling down the code or doing whatever. Doing that's completely fine. But the minute you have one more developer on your team, it becomes a team sport. What does that mean? Rules of engagement, right? If everybody has access to that server and they're doing pulls, who knows what commands they're running. I'll never forget when I first started learning Shell, I tried to do a deployment myself before we had pipelines, and I ran an RM command, and I put RM star because in that directory I was in, I wanted to delete everything. So I did that. And then about 15 minutes later, I had this dude kick down my door, which was one of the sysadmin guys, and he was like, "Why did you run that?" And I'm like, "Sorry," right? He's like, apparently he uses the history where he'll put the number in the history of the command to run, and he's like, "I've done it before where I've accidentally reran that." I was like, that sounds like a personal problem, right? But apparently it was my fault. Anyway, having more than one person on a server is just ripe for bad news, right? With pipelines, you can make that to where it deploys it. It's the only thing that really truly needs access to that server, and you can kind of abstract away the need to be on that having all your developers on that server doing God knows what. So, coding is a team sport. Once you got more than one person, it becomes a situation where pipelines are super valuable. The one thing I always hear about saying, oh, you should use pipelines or automated, people say CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous delivery, whatever you want to say, essentially is the end-to-end development lifecycle of testing and deploying your application. Most of the time when I say go use it, they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. I know C++ and that's what I know. That's way too hard. Most of the time when somebody says it's way too hard, it's just because the fear of not knowing something. I think everybody here at one point, they've ran into a new technology, and it's natural to be afraid or natural to be fearful of trying to learn something new. And coming over that barrier is what separates the people from learning a bunch to the ones that are staying in their lane and slowly becoming archaic, right? It's not that hard. If you know how to read output from a log, if you know basic bash scripting or PowerShell if you're dealing with Windows, nothing advanced, just basic stuff, commands, and you know how to work around SSHing, that's enough, right? Yes, you need to know what YAML is, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But essentially, at the end of the day, most of the problems that you run into, you can just Google your way out of, right? Or even better yet, nowadays, you can just chat GPT your way out of it, right? We are in that day and age now where I can say, hey, I need a pipeline. For example, one of my bigger clients was like, hey, we're using ADO, Azure DevOps. We need you to build all the pipelines for that. Never used it in my life. Nobody there at the team was using it either. And so I'm like, okay, I've got to learn something new. I'm afraid, right? Imposter syndrome, etc. I know a way I can figure this out. I need to do X, Y, Z. So I went over to ChatGPT, threw on version 4 because you're going to get a little bit better stuff, I feel like. And I said, hey, give me an Azure DevOps pipeline that runs this command and tests this. and it gave me 90% of what I want. And in fact, it started to like hallucinate and like coming up with features that ADO didn't even have, right? But the point is 90% of that stuff did work. It just took the little 10% of my human brain power to figure out the pieces that didn't and fix them. So within a day, I got a pipeline up and running, and everybody, the beauty of DevOps, I've been doing software development so long that DevOps, it seems like software developers think you're some sort of wizard or something because you're like getting code out of their box and onto a server. And it's really not that difficult. I've been coding less, and on the surface, everybody thinks I'm doing more, right? So pipelines are cool, and I'm going to show you. Yes?
One thing I learned recently, too, as far as automating us do it, not having to do it yourself, came up with a lot of templates, too, I guess, for setting up repositories with it built in. So when I deployed my website, I was able to get a GitHub or Azure DevOps pipeline running in a couple hours with containers, with deployment to Azure, everything. And it was all based on a template that was already there. So.
Template that the docs provided,
No, it's a
or
GitHub
just
template.
yeah.
GitHub, you can specify a template when you create a repository. It's a lesser known feature. I didn't know about it, but you can actually create. Basically, there's templates in there that can do different. Set up the GitHub repository with GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps to basically you put your code in the GitHub repository and you check it in, and that's it. You commit it, and everything takes it from there. And next thing you know, it's on Azure. You have to set up your Azure website and everything, or your AWS, whatever. But it makes it all really easy and containerizes it. So.
Yeah. I'm going to show too, like how to actually go to an open source project and see the code for their pipelines too, right? Because it's all there. It's just knowing where to go. So we'll do like a kind of live demo at the end where I'll kind of show you kind of how to reverse engineer that kind of stuff. So how does this work from A to Z? Well, you're on your laptop updating some code, and hopefully you're not breaking stuff like me, but you're writing some code, hopefully you're testing, and at the end you're like, okay, this looks great. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to push this up to either GitLab or wherever your code repository is, right? So you usually push up your branch, and then you'll create a pull request, merge request, whatever you want to call it. And then from there, somebody reviews it, they'll approve it, it runs tests, and at the end you merge it. And that's kind of the testing side of things. So this is kind of pre-deployment sort of stages, right? Pretty simple. Today I'm going to show you, I wanted to keep this talk pretty simple, where we weren't introducing building and pushing container images and doing more advanced topics. This template I'm going to show you is more simple, and I would say old school maybe is not the right way, but we're just going to have a simple web server, and we're just going to push up to that code to that web server, right? We're not building a Docker image. We're not doing anything advanced there. But I'll talk a little bit about how that workflow would work. So in that code repository, let's say that merge request, the code you just changed, gets merged. Wonderful. Usually, at that point, there could be a manual deployment that needs to happen, and hopefully it's through a pipeline. So at some point, your code's been developed or merged into the develop branch, and somebody's like, this looks great, maybe 2 or 3 other pull requests get pulled in, and then a manual button is clicked in the pipelines to launch the deployment job. Or alternatively, it could be completely automated. Every time something gets merged into the branch, it just automatically pushes it up to some staging environment, somewhere where quality assurance or even the developers can go on to a shared environment and test a feature. The project owner, whoever, right? Somewhere where everyone can see the feature or the change and test it to make sure it looks good before you actually push it live. And then the final step here really is getting it onto that server, right? So you have EC2, whatever you're running out there, to actually push the code. Just to talk a little bit about images and containerize, so this is building the actual code and running your install commands, npm build, whatever you need to do, packaging that up as a zip, and then just pushing that out there to get extracted on here and calling it done. With container images, it would work similarly in the sense where the build would happen, it would run your build commands and such in a container, and then it would take a snapshot of that Docker container at that point in time, and that image would be pushed up into some container registry wherever you're hosting, Azure, AWS, GCP, whatever it is. That container registry now says, at this point in time, this is what has your application code, perhaps. It has all the dependencies it needs to run your application. And then when the actual deployment happens, that's when you're just switching out your old image containers with the new image containers. In this whole process, and I'm not going to cover it in detail, but it always is important to have what's called a rollback strategy. Because at some point, you're going to deploy code like I have. Just don't deploy the code and walk away, which is one mistake I've made before. Coming back to the desk and everybody yelling at you that the production logs are rolling out of control and we need to roll back. Having a pipeline to roll back the code is an additional, more advanced step that I would suggest that you get in place, where it pushes the old version of the code back out there. So you can use things like tagging in your repository. Once you have something you think that works, tag it with a date time, maybe a letter or something like that if you have multiple pushes in a day. And then you call that tag, you essentially push that tag. That way, if you need to roll back, we can roll back to XYZ at any point. So that's just kind of a little bit, I wanted to talk about more advanced things there, but most of the examples here are going to be talking about the bare bones. Let's push something to a server and kind of leave the whole container registry piece out of that.
Josh,
Yes.
just because you mentioned Amazon in that last slide, could you actually just go back? I know you put simple architecture here, but this is actually really complicated if you think about it. Because if you're going to go through this, well, maybe just because the Docker icon in there, because if you're going to go through this step of containerizing, it doesn't make sense to push to a service like EC2. Like Amazon itself actually has services like, I mean, I hate to call out Elastic Beanstalk, but there's like ECS. There's another one too. App Runner, I think, is the one I'm looking for, where it goes straight from code into whatever. It's probably going to be serverless at the end of the day, but it builds those pipelines for you. Like it's a platform built to do everything you just described is already in there. So I just wanted to call that out, just because you put Amazon EC2 there, and that's informative for anyone in here. They didn't know about those services.
Yeah, absolutely. So people who are comfortable with containers, images, etc., definitely look at Elastic Container Service, Kubernetes. Those things are definitely your way to go, because scaling the application is going to be a heck of a lot simpler than a traditional like ASG, like an auto-scaling group with multiple servers that have to go through some build process. For the sake of what some people were asking, I've got a bare metal server. How do I deploy to it, right? How do I build pipelines in front of it? But absolutely, like if you're competent enough to be able to go, you know what, I'm totally fine using containers. I understand how they work and the build process and the tagging around it. ECS and all the tooling around that exists. And it is arguably probably simpler than EC2 if you have that knowledge, right? Well, I'm talking more like there's a lot of legacy apps out there still sitting on a server, right? So, but absolutely. We might be able to jump into some of that because I do have an example of using ECS that's open source that I'll share with you folks. Okay, so jobs. I don't have the time on me, but if somebody can just make sure around that like 3:50 mark, just yell. But let's see where we're at. Yeah, okay. So about 40 minutes. So jobs. This is this was a snapshot from one of the pipelines that I have out there. Forgive me for the PHP side of things. I know I get yelled at for still using PHP, but deal with it. Essentially, this is what your typical pipeline looks like. You'll have a stage that installs and gets all your dependencies ready to go, and then you have another one that's dedicated to running the tests in your pipeline. In here, you can kind of see a variety of different tests that I have. I have like a code syntax thing, checking like best practices and such, code standards, running lint to make sure it actually can compile. And as you can see here, I broke a test. So I could click on this, I can go in there, I can see what test I broke, and go there to fix it. To talk a little bit about the Elastic Container side of things, I'll share this URL, but I open sourced a project called Phobos, the moon of Mars, but obviously with a PHP flair in the front of that. But this is a open source example of how to use GitHub Actions, Elastic Container Service, Docker, and a simple PHP application where it'll build it, push it up, and do it all through pipelines, right? There is some initial setup you have to do, obviously, like setting up the AWS account, getting the actual authentication set up. All of that's covered in that README. So if you do need like a template or something like that, this exists out here for you to take a look at. But what I wanted to highlight here is what we saw here before is GitLab. Now we're looking at GitHub Actions. So you'll have a tab here that says Actions, and in here, these are all of your different workflows, as they call it. So I kind of just threw some numbers in here, so that way it makes it very clear. You want to run this 1, 2, 3, 4 sort of thing. So in here you can see I have my Terraform plan. This will tell me what it's going to build out on AWS. My Terraform apply, hey, actually go build what you said is going to be built. Then the Docker build and push. To your point, this is where the image is being built and then pushed up to Elastic Container Registry where the actual images are being hosted. And then some other things here to deploy the actual application. And then if you're feeling frisky, you can just go and destroy everything. One part of the whole pipeline thing is triggers. So for pipelines, there are various triggers that you can set up for when you want a pipeline to actually kick off. There's a lot of different ones. It gets pretty advanced, but like you can do scheduled jobs. I want to run nightly builds or whatever. You can totally do that. Some of the main ones here are when I push code up to my branch, you can trigger pipelines to automatically run when that happens. Or I create a pull request on my branch, you can have pipelines that run and have to pass before I can merge that branch. That is crucial in the software development lifecycle. If you don't have that piece, there's no guarantee that the tests haven't broke, right? And then you can also do things like code coverage to make sure if you're adding new code, it's being covered with tests. And then those can fail under some threshold if they haven't added tests. And then my favorite, manual launch, right? So deployment, for example. I'm not always the type where once you merge it, it has to be pushed. In some rare cases, you don't want to push something maybe because it's dependent on another branch being merged, whatever the case may be. So automated deployments are completely fine. In this example back here, we could have a deployment one at the end here that will automatically kick off once it's merged. But in some cases, I like to set up manual deployments, especially for production, right? If it's a case where you want to make sure you're in front of the computer when it's actually pushing code live, that's something you're going to want to be manually triggered. So how that's done is through YAML in your actual GitHub or your GitLab pipeline code. You have some basic YAML here. In GitHub's example, they have the trigger of pull request and then this on. So you could do on push, on pull request. And then in here, you can also do fancy things like specifying the branch. This only does it for the develop branch. This only does it for the main branch, whatever the case may be. And then same thing with GitLab, perhaps a little bit more verbose on the GitLab side. I've noticed that GitHub's a little shorter sometimes. But GitLab, you can say, hey, this has to be a merge request event in order for this to trigger off my workflow. So you have workflow rules, and you can set up, I mean, this is full Turing compatible in the sense of you can do if, else, and all kinds of other stuff for it to actually kick off your pipeline. So in here, this is a super duper simple example of what a pipeline would look like to run a test. In here, you have a stage. This is GitLab. And then here is your definition of your stage. So in here, I've called it PHP unit. This is in this stage here. I'm using this image for this. You can specify the image at the root level here as well. But perhaps maybe if you do need different images, one to build the node side, you can do that. Typically, I do like to put the image at the root. And then at the end here, these are your bash. This is the bash skill part of what I was talking about. So any bash commands that you can think of or dream up of, this is where typically you'd put those. So I want to run the installation of the dependencies, and then I want to actually trigger the tests to run. On the GitHub side of things, a little longer, but achieves the same thing. So I'm going to on push or on pull run this pipeline or GitHub action. And here are my steps. So this will run on the Ubuntu container. So everything from here on out will run on that Ubuntu container. And I'm going to check out my code. I'm going to set up PHP. This installs whatever version I specify here. I'm going to install my dependencies, and then I'm going to run my tests. So all of this is kind of pre. You could put this into a separate step called install, and then all the individual stages from there can run your individual tests like what I showed earlier. And by the way, I'll show this here in a minute, but that's all stuffed under a directory called .github. The period is kind of hidden directory if you haven't or not familiar with that, but typically that's in a quote-unquote hidden folder in your root of your project, and you have a workflow directory where you're stuffing all of these different YAML files for your different pipelines. So we've talked about testing. Now I'm going to show some deployment examples. Again, forgive me for the screenshots, but I'm going to just walk through this a little bit. This is, again, deploying to an EC2 instance. So this is a GitLab example. I've got some variables I've set up here that you can replace out with your needs. So which IP is the server located at? What's the deploy path to the actual application? And then your private key. So again, GitLab, GitHub, whatever, in this legacy case of it having to connect to a single server, needs that SSH connection. With the advent of ECS and all this other stuff, you can abstract a lot of this stuff out and make things quote unquote more secure by using something called like OpenID, where you don't need the whole IAM keys, you don't need keys at all. You can just say, this GitHub repository has access to this role in my AWS account. That role can do XYZ and XYZ only. Then you can do things like protect the branch and stuff, so you make sure that nobody can kind of just write their own stuff and do stuff against your environment. So in here, this is the before script tag that GitLab supports. So again, this is going to be things you're going to be setting stuff up to do eventually what you want to do. In this case, installing the OpenSSH client, installing our key, and also marking the server as a known host in SSH. So just getting everything prepped up for me to actually reach out to that server. Then we have our build stage. Again, same thing as we did in the tests. We have all of our installation pieces that we need here. But more importantly, we start to get into a more advanced topic called artifacts. These artifacts get cached. The reason you need to do cache is because these pipelines, in some cases, I've seen pipelines take an hour to run. And most of the time, it's because they're not caching anything. So all of these steps here, such as compose or install, might install 500 megabytes of dependencies that the project needs. By you specifying artifacts and the paths to your artifacts, such as this vendor folder, which is everything installed at this point, now that 500 megabytes gets put in the cache, and at some interval, whether it be an hour, or you could even do this based on a SHA hash of the directory or something like that, or the commit, or the branch name, At some point, you can invalidate that cache, but now every time that this pipeline runs, within the next hour, it's already going to have that 500 megabytes, and this command is going to be super quick. So a way to speed up the pipelines and not to eat up GitLab minutes or GitHub action minutes for you to spend there. There is also a more advanced topic where you can actually have your own containers running on your own system, and you're not even using shared environments to run your build and deployment. We're not going to cover that, but it's an option. So moving on, the last piece here to actually do the deployment, pretty straightforward. We're going to deploy the code, which essentially just involves us SCPing, which basically is just a SSH copy over to the server. So typically it's source destination, right? Our source is everything that's here locally, and then here's our deploy path. This is the actual server, and then this colon here, everything after this is the path where we're going to actually copy all the files to on the server. If you're not familiar with SCP, this is super cool. I've seen people do the most craziest things trying to get a file off of a server, like, oh, I'll push it to an S3 bucket from the server, and then I'll pull it down from the S3 bucket. I'm like, why didn't you just SCP? They didn't know about it. SSH, and then let's just run our deploy script here, run some migrations, and we're done. So pretty simple. Now, on the GitHub side of things, we're going to see a lot of similarities, except obviously the syntax changes a bit. Feel free to go over to their docs, take a look at the different syntax depending on what you need. But here, same thing. Here's the container image that we want to run on. This is a base level GitHub action that GitHub provides. So if you wanted to see the code here, you can actually just go on GitHub, go to the actions repository that they have, and check out the checkout folder there to see all the code that thing runs. Same thing here. We're kind of just using an open source project that already has a pre-built action, so it abstracts a lot of what we need to get this done. The key here is this tag. So we're saying the GitHub repository, we're using the v2 tag on this repository. If you're super security conscious, this tag can get replaced. So you could do something like take the actual git commit hash and put that there, so you 100% know that's what you ran before is what you're running now. Perhaps that even can get overwritten, but anyway. With the next piece here, same deal. We are installing all the dependencies, then we're building a tar file of everything here, and then at the end we're uploading that artifact onto the server. So pretty straightforward. I guess, are there any questions here about this piece? Yeah.
You mentioned caching. Aren't you going to get a new container every time you run it? So caching is not going to make any difference as far as multiple runs, right? I assume you mean caching within the same run, right?
I'll show you how that works here in a minute. It does actually work in between builds. So if I run a subsequent build, I'll show you what happens for that cache to get pulled down. Yeah. So it's essentially like GitLab, GitHub. They have like a cache store for you to use, right? You should only be caching things that are not sensitive though, right? Like in this case, it's dependencies that are open source. But let's say that you do have private dependencies within your organization that aren't public repositories. That's when you would probably want to use your own containers and your own runners to do the builds. That way you're not like caching sensitive information or proprietary code, right? So the last piece of this is actually taking that tar file and pushing it out to the server. Again, we're using an open source GitHub action, so we don't have to put in all of those SSH commands we saw previously. And we just plug in our variables, and we'll talk a little bit about variables here in a second. And then the last piece is just getting onto that box and then running migrations or doing whatever we need to do there. Yes?
I was gonna say, in your previous, it's actually, I would consider it a bad practice to use bash in any automation, because bash is extremely capable of messing things up if the person does something, like to your point, maybe they accidentally put an RM star in there.
Yeah.
What you have here though, where you're using the module specifically designed to SCP files or whatever it's doing, or authenticate in this case, that's what I would advise people to do. Use a pipeline module for that task, rather than referring. Bash is like your plan B. Make it your plan Z, actually. If all else fails, there's bash.
Yeah.
But before bash, maybe use something that has some like some type checking, like use Python before you go all the way to the bash, like entry point. But if there's no pipeline module for it, then use something else, and then use bash if that other thing.
Absolutely, yeah. Bash can be dangerous, absolutely, especially when you're dealing with root on a server or something like that. I would venture to say in some cases, some of these may even be using advanced things like Ansible or something like that to abstract away the whole bash layer. At the end of the day, most of the time it's running bash, but a lot of that type checking and stuff is already built into some of those products and stuff like that, right? And this is tested and open source if there's a security issue. The community is handling that rather than you having to kind of gut check everything being added into it. So absolutely utilizing, and like I said, making sure that whatever GitHub action you're using, add a tag, because if you don't add this @ and a version number, you're going to be pulling down the latest and greatest of whoever just pushed code in there. And there could be bad stuff that got snuck in there last minute. So try to use tags.
The other thing I would say, his comment over there, is that if you're deploying on Windows, you're not really going to have the new Windows. I guess they're trying to put a bash shell on it, but you're going to have to use a PowerShell script unless you use like some other scripting technology like you were talking about. That'd be another reason not to use bash, is that it's not.
Depending on your environment, absolutely. For the Azure example I was talking about, I was actually on not an Ubuntu, but a Windows box, and I had to write PowerShell. But to that point, again, I found some open source modules I was able to utilize, and there was very little PowerShell that I actually had to run, right? In some cases, I've even seen the example where you just throw everything into a script file that's committed in the repository, and all you're doing at the end here in your pipeline is saying, okay, deploy.sh or deploy.PowerShell, right? And then just running that, and that's kind of a whole separate file from this, so you don't have to continually change this. You're just fixing the deployment script. I might have to start zipping through some of this because I know we're getting low on time here. But I just wanted to show kind of like a broad view when you're kind of backed out and you're looking at just all the pipelines running for your repository. This is typically what this looks like. So you'll see your failed ones, the ones that passed, maybe with warnings. Like in this case, there's a warning here. You may want to check that out before merging it. Ones that are running in flight, so you can kind of see, okay, this one's running here. I could click on this and see the console output of where that's at in that build. I can click here to cancel it, or I can click the play button to replay it, or you can even download the artifacts if you wanted to take a peek at stuff. And then again, in the GitLab world, this is your typical kind of pipeline, but I wanted to highlight here, you have an automatic deployment to a staging environment that happens right after your tests, but then you have a manual job that you need to hit the play button here to manually kick off that production deployment, which maybe can only be done by a handful of people on the team that have elevated privileges to be able to do that. So in your pipelines, you can define this person needs a maintainer role in order to do this. All right, so we'll zip through this a little bit because a lot of this stuff I feel like everybody kind of is either known or can check out later. Yeah.
Did you mention like data check-ins and the fact that you usually run the pipeline as part of your pull request process? And I was hoping that you would say something about that, just so that please run your pipeline as part of your pull request approval process so that tests are run and code is linted before the pull request is approved. If you're setting up a new pipeline, please do that.
That's like bare minimum. Yeah, absolutely. I would say if you're going to use pipelines, just add a pipeline that runs when a pull request is made. And then to your point, as long as it's passing, then it can be merged, right?
Right. Then the same pull request, the same thing after the pull request is made, but on a different branch.
Yeah. You can stop the timer because I think I have 10 minutes left still. Well, 20, technically 30 minutes, but I want to save some time here at the end. So in that example, I was talking about SSHing and all that stuff. So I just wanted to show real quick, the steps that you would have to do. You would have to create your key. You would have to get your private key, copy that private key, and put that into CI/CD variables as a secret. Then take your public key, go onto the server, and then say, server, this is a known authorized key that is allowed to access this user. So in this case, I'm developing my key pair. I'm outputting the private key. I've clipped off the end, so don't think you're sharp and you can just copy this. Plus, I'm not using it anywhere anyway. But you'll want to clip off the beginning and end piece here, and you copy that, remove white space. And that's what you're going to plug into GitLab or GitHub. So you're going to go here. On your left, you have your settings panel. You go to integrations, and there's a variable section here. You're going to paste in your value, give it a key. This key is what we saw in the variable section in the pipeline. So this automatically will get injected into your pipeline when it runs. The key here, though, is you want to mark this as either a secret in GitHub Actions or a masked variable in GitLab. That way it can't be leaked in the output of the actual pipeline. So if you want to get super advanced, using things like AWS secrets or something like that might be a better way to manage things like this. But this works. At the end of the day, it just works. So this is it. It's saved. It's marked as masked. There's the value, which is marked out. I'm not sure if I could copy that. I wonder if I could. But essentially, as the thing's running, if it does echo out this value, or even if somebody nefarious did say output this value, GitHub, GitLab is smart enough to know this is a one-to-one match of a known secret and won't actually output that still. Perhaps there's ways they could still send it out, but anyway, this is just we're just talking about the basics here. In GitHub Actions, it's a little different. Under Actions and Settings here, there's a Action Secrets, and you can create a new secret, and same deal, key value store. So once you save that, that's where your secrets will be held here, and same deal. If those output, it won't actually output the full values. So here we're going to actually run it. Forgive me, this is like super zoomed out. Let me see if I can, I can zoom in a bit here. Whoop. Shucks. Bear with me. Okay, so somebody asked about cache. So when the tests or the deployment's about to run and you click on one of those pipelines, this right here is the actual pipeline output. In here you can see whatever you've marked as cache or an artifact, there are steps that are done at the very beginning of this, right after it pulls down the code, where it then starts checking for cache. For example, I've marked yarn, my composer dependencies as cache, and it will download this cache automatically. Again, if you set some TTL, time to live, on the cache, or better yet, setting the branch or SHA of that directory is your best bet. That way you don't have what's called bad cache, right? Where you actually do want it to run composer install again. So doing things like saying, hey, take a look at the lock file, and that lock file, look at the SHA hash of that file. If that changes, invalidate the cache. That's your best practice there for making sure you're always pulling down fresh dependencies. Zoom back out here. Okay, so a bit about the manual deployment side of things. I'll actually go in here and kind of show you that, where you can click that, but that's for manual deployments, and then that's it for the slides. So I'll dive into the live demo piece, but thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I do want to reserve some time to talk about next month's meetup, but let me just show you guys the open source example I was talking about here. And if you do want to get a hold of me, hit me up. I'm on most social medias at OG Programmer. You can go to remotedevforce.com. My email's there as well, or that's my cell phone number, or grab a card here at the end. Always happy to discuss if you have questions or anything like that. So cheat code number 1, ChatGPT. So I was working with, for example, I'm a noob at PowerShell, right? So I was like, hey, give me PowerShell, and it did that. Taught me how to do stuff in PowerShell. And then, for example, ADO, I had questions about doing certain things in Azure DevOps that I wasn't aware of how to do, right? So again, this is you have to work back and forth. It's a bit of a massaging process to finally get what you want. But here is an example of an Azure DevOps pipeline that runs some build configurations. Here's the image that it's going to use for the build, and then the steps. Very similar to the other ones, but again, a lot of this stuff does translate between all the different pipeline examples out there. They just maybe use different words for kind of the overall command for that sort of stuff.
Josh, did you ever use visual ADO pipeline builder?
Yes, I have.
What did you think of it?
It's just like having Git UI tools. It can abstract a lot of the stuff and make stuff super simple for newbies to get into it. The problem is when you want to start doing something advanced, or something's not working, or you want to see what's happening under the hood, you've been maybe abstracted, but like you've been spoiled that you haven't had to actually dig into the YAML of what the thing is doing. So you don't really know how to fix it. For super simple things like send an email or whatever, like there are pre-built things that I've done in the UI part of things. However, I'm not aware of a feature that it was able to actually like export all of that YAML. Like it was all through the UI.
You could switch between.
That's what I was gonna say. Is
Yeah,
I
okay.
got it for free, but the old boss didn't like YAML, but he wanted to click everything, and as soon as he left, we exported all of them. And I was actually gonna recommend that if you don't know YAML very well, you might feel more comfortable clicking and dragging for a while, and then export what you got.
Yeah, I didn't see that, but I'm not surprised. At the end of the day, under the hood, it probably has that. I may have been even using kind of like one of the very first projects that Azure had there. Yeah, so perfectly fine. And I bet you if GitHub already hasn't built it, they'll probably have something similar in the future where it becomes like Legos, right? You can just drag and drop different actions in there and build out the pipeline, and all you need to do is pretty much just provide the variables for it and you're done. So if you want to learn something new, ChatGPT is a good place to start. Obviously Google and such. This right here is the open source project I was talking about called Phobos. Basically, this is an open source GitHub Actions workflow for you to use Terraform, GitHub, and CI/CD actions with that to deploy a PHP application onto AWS using the Elastic Container Service. So in here, you'll have the Terraform, which has all your modules broken out, such as the infrastructure. So here's my actual ECS cluster and the configurations for it. And then to actually launch my application into ECS, here's where I actually have my service defined. And you can see here, this is your ECS task definition and all that kind of stuff. So this is an out-of-the-box approach where you can just ditch the PHP stuff and use something more modern like Node or whatever, and just swap out your app folder and change the GitHub actions to build your project appropriately. But the key here is in most open source projects that have pipelines, you can go and take a sneak peek at what they're doing for their pipelines by navigating to their code and going to that .github folder, looking in the workflows, and all the different YAML files are sitting right there for you to take a look at. So for example, my Terraform plan step here, you can see here where I am doing pre-flight checks, getting things set up for output and such, and then all my different steps here. So checking out the code, doing certain things when certain things should be ran and shouldn't. For example, with staging, we may want to do that only on the develop branch. For production branch, we want to make sure we're running on the main branch. And then configuring our like AWS credentials, setting up Terraform, and then running our actual Terraform commands and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I guess, oh, the last thing I wanted to show is like manually launching a job. The AWS account is teared down, so it's not going to work, but I can show you where the button is essentially. So here in your Terraform plan step, for example, you would click on the action that you want to run, and on the right-hand side here, we have a run workflow button. You would click on that, and you would just specify what branch do we want to run this as. So for example, if you have a test branch where I've added a new piece of AWS service or something like that, I'm not completely sure if I want to keep it, you could come here, click on your test branch, and then click Run Workflow. And then from there, it will run it, and then you can just click, once you refresh here, you can see the running action. It's now running in GitHub Actions. They do provide a free amount of minutes for open source repositories, which I never actually hit when I was giving this presentation multiple times at conferences and such. So they give you a lot out of the box to use for free, which is awesome at GitHub. GitLab does have kind of like a free tier, but I've ran into that pretty quickly of caps there with GitLab. And now they like changed their pricing structure altogether with GitLab. It's kind of frustrating. But anyway, so that is it. Does anybody have like particular questions about pipelines before we move on to a couple other things here?
Question. You said you use Azure DevOps and GitHub. I know Microsoft owns both now. What do you think the future is as far like if you're building a new pipeline, you kind of have the choice of either one. I think Azure DevOps is a little more full featured currently. Have you heard anything about like which direction Microsoft is planning to go with? Because they use this kind of the same thing in a lot of cases. What do you think about that?
I think they will stay as two separate products. I don't think Microsoft wants to screw this up, meaning GitHub. When they purchased it, they weren't purchasing the technology, they were purchasing all the code that GitHub has for their AI stuff, right? Microsoft wanted to beef up their AI stance, and by having access to basically all of the world's open source code in GitHub, it really bolstered their AI technologies, right? Like we saw, I use GitHub Copilot on top of using ChatGPT, which by the way, at the next meetup, I do want to talk a little bit about GPT Engineer and cursor.sh. One of the frustrating things I've dealt with ChatGPT or GitHub Copilot is it deals within the context of the file that I'm in. But what if I want to build an entire application? We're talking multiple directories, multiple files. AI doesn't, or at least those tools are not designed for that. However, GPT Engineer, GPT Engineer, Cursor.sh, and a few others have recently caught my interest because it promises that it can get to that point. Again, there are people in the AI world that are super bullish that one day this is going to completely cannibalize the software development industry. I disagree. I think we're probably decades away from that being an actual fact. Again, just like self-driving cars, you still have somebody sitting in the seat, and that probably will be for the foreseeable future, right? Because it can handle 90% of the cases. It's the 10% of the edge cases that still do need that human intervention. Once it can get to that point, then maybe those Tesla robots will be around and they'll just decide to kill all humans. We'll see. But for now, I think it's still far enough away, so we have to look at this as a tool rather than something that's taking our jobs, right? So I do want to do a lightning talk about that. And speaking of lightning talks, that's what we're going to do for next month's meetup, is we're going to have 3 lightning talks. So we have 2 spots filled, mine, as well as we're going to be talking about Git. So getting underneath the hood on like the top 10 things in Git, right? Does anybody, speaking of Git, does anybody have particular things they would like to dive into as far as Git, whether it be frustrations they're dealing with? Just Git in general? Yeah. Yeah. Anything in particular?
Gauge of how much experience people have, or people are actually using.
Yeah, who uses Git? Okay, who uses Git in the command line? Okay, a few, okay.
So who doesn't know anything about Git and will be completely confused and caught? Okay, good.
We love you, Darcy. Yeah.
So like a super beginner talk would not be appropriate of like how to commit files. Okay, that's good to know. So, okay.
I would love to see something where it does have some of what you would need as a new person, just understanding like the basics, but then some of the advanced things like I was talking about, handling, you know, when you've completely screwed up a branch, that would be things I would be interested in. You know. No, so 3, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes per. Yeah.
So would you guys be interested in like how to like what I was talking about screwed up a branch or something, or that the kind of thing, or we're looking for ideas. Git is a big topic. There's probably more. You probably do 2 days of training on it. So we're trying to think of like what would be most useful for people.
Merge conflicts.
Merge conflicts?
Merge conflicts.
Okay.
Yeah.
How to handle them?
How to handle them.
Well, how to
I
basically.
find them harder to deal with than you would think.
I agree with that. When you're merging conflicts, I think you can definitely screw stuff up.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
And it's hidden.
Yeah, merge conflicts would be a good one. And okay, so we have one more spot for a lightning talk. You had your hand up?
Yeah, you might not consider this because it's kind of dumb, but I was on a project and the guy, he had like his own like Git philosophy with custom commands, and then whenever you would do like a push or a pull, not a push, but I believe a pull request in it where you can see what has changed or what has been fixed. You put like emojis and custom templates to say fixed, broken, that you can see on the GitHub next to the file or the folder, like how it's updated. Like on Git, you can see like what was fixed.
Oh, and
Right.
comment?
Yeah.
And on the commit itself?
Not on the
GitHub?
commit, but like next to the Git file.
Oh, that's a call. Isn't that?
I think that is the last Git commit that was on the last Git commit message that was done on that file is what shows next to it.
But it was like a template, and it was short and had emojis, and you could also change it to say like instead of like PR request, you could have it be something custom.
This was in command line Git, or are we talking Git?
Yeah. It was like
Because you could build an alias for anything, yeah. So
Yeah.
he probably built a bunch of aliases to make it more user friendly.
oh yeah, it was like super cool. know it like kind of abstracted the actual commands.
And did it only run on Bash or did it run on PowerShell as well? Git.
I mean, I only use Git Bash, so yeah.
Is it open source? Like, could you send it to him so he could take a peek at it?
I'd have to ask him. Yeah, it's like philosophy.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
I was gonna say, so this is my first time coming to this meeting. I just moved to Vegas as well from Toronto, and I really like this community. I think
Yeah, welcome.
Your last talk in particular, I think you kind of did focus on a good intersection between theory and practical industrial like engineering, like this is how software gets built. I have a few. That topic, by the way, it can dovetail into so many other things. I was talking to some folks here earlier, and I mentioned Dora metrics or the Dora matrix. Is anyone familiar with that? Dora? Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's a topic I've given many talks about, and how to, because like that's the best way to justify investment into this specific topic to your non-technical business leaders. It's like, hey, if you let me orchestrate and automate everything, we'll make more money and we'll be able to retain better talent. And this is the framework you can measure it at. So there's,
Cool.
There's Dora. There's like.
I'm familiar with Dora the Explorer, but that's as far as.
If you haven't heard of this, if you Google and Dora, you can go to dora.dev, D-O-R-A.dev. It's a think tank, stands for DevOps Operational Research and Assessment. Like Google's a big company behind it.
Do you want to give a talk about that then? That'd be awesome. Yeah,
Lots of cloud computing stuff too between Amazon, GCP, and Azure. I can talk to as well.
yeah.
We'll link up after this.
That'd be great because I think that that's a big thing, a part of software development is there's always a chasm between the product owners and the software developers, right? Because honestly, at some point you do have to shoot the software developer and release it, and they'll sit there and code on it all day. So it is a dance between business and development, and sometimes convincing the business side for practical justification of, hey, the last 5 times we released, twice we broke it and we lost X amount of money. This is a way we could fix it, right? Isn't always justifiable in some cases. But I think with metrics and dashboards, business people love dashboards, right? So I'd love to see stuff like that. Cool, okay. So those will be our 3 topics. Just do me a favor, we'll link up and let me get your contact information. That way I can get your bios and stuff like that so we can list those. We do have a free JetBrains license to give away today. So if you are interested in the JetBrains products, they have PyCharm, IntelliJ, you name it. I have a free 1-year license for any of their products. So just come grab me and I'll give you that. As well as Symfony casts. If you are interested in learning more about Symfony, they also have a JavaScript track there too. I have a 1-month free license to all the videos and training material that they have. So yeah, I think that pretty much concludes the meetup. Thanks obviously for Vegas, Tech Alley for hosting Vegas programmers. We really appreciate that. And the Vegas Theater Company. I was just saying, like, I always love, every month I come here. Who was here like the last month when there was like trash over here, like a mountain of trash? Yeah, a few of you. Yeah, I mean, it was like wild, right? Like I thought I was on Mars or something like that. I used to go to Switch and we'd have this one room. It was always super cold and metal desks and stuff like that. And it was just like the same thing every time. Every time I walk in here, I don't know if I'm putting on a play or if I'm giving a technical talk. I love it. So.
The living room today.
Yeah, maybe in a couple months we'll have karaoke or something instead. Who knows? So again, thanks for everybody for coming out, and thank you to Rick and thank you to Ryan for helping record. You guys rock. And with that, I bid you adieu. Have a great night. Oh, we'll go over to Taverna, by the way. Usually we go hang out there because we do have to get out of here at 4 o'clock. Ciao.